I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Now, today, we drink seltzer. Today, we enter the third day of the Trump shutdown, the first ever real shutdown to occur when one party controls the entire legislative process. The Republican Party controls the House, the Senate, the presidency, and yet they were unable to keep the government open for the American people. Leader McConnell knows it takes 60 votes to win passage of a spending bill, and yet he moved forward with a last-minute extension that he knew lacked the votes. Both Democrats and Republicans voted against that bill. The reason the Republican majority had such difficulty finding consensus is they could never get a firm grip on what the president of their party wanted to do. These days, you never know who to deal with when it comes to the Republicans. The Republican leaders told me to work out a deal with the White House. The White House said work it out with Republican leaders on the Hill. Separately, President Trump turned away from not one, but two bipartisan compromises. Each would have averted this shutdown. Each would have led to a deal on the budget and health care and disaster aid and things like opioids and veterans and pensions and on immigration. My recent offer to the president was a generous one. I put his signature campaign issue on the table in exchange for DACA, and still he turned away. President Trump's unwillingness to compromise caused the Trump shutdown and brought us to this moment. The facts are well known. Now I wish to update the Senate on where things stand after this weekend. Since our meeting in the Oval Office on Friday, the President and I have not spoken, and the White House refused to engage in negotiations over the weekend. The great deal-making President sat on the sidelines. Despite and because of this frustration, I've been having conversations with the Republican leader over the weekend about a path forward. After several discussions, offers, counteroffers, the Republican leader and I have come to an arrangement. We will vote today to reopen the government, to continue negotiating a global agreement, with the commitment that, if an agreement isn't reached by February the 8th, the Senate will immediately proceed to consideration of legislation dealing with DACA. The process will be neutral and fair to all sides. We expect that a bipartisan bill on DACA will receive fair consideration and an up or down vote on the floor. Now, it's a shame, Mr. President, that the American people and the Senate have had to endure such hand-wringing, finger-pointing stridency to secure a guarantee that we will finally move to address this urgent issue. It is something the majority could have avoided entirely, a concern the President could have obviated if he were only willing to take yes for an answer. While this procedure will not satisfy everyone on both sides, it's a way forward. I'm confident that we can get the 60 votes in the Senate for a DACA bill. And now there is a real pathway to get a bill on the floor and through the Senate. It is a good solution, and I will vote for it. I'm incredibly grateful to the bipartisan group that has come together in recent days to renew the immigration debate with a sense of urgency. There you are. I believe that this group has the potential to return the Senate to the kind of place it should be on the issue of immigration, a place for bipartisanship, a place for action, a place for achievement. The bipartisan group, in a very fine way, filled the glaring absence of the President in these talks. I expect the Majority Leader to fulfill his commitment to the Senate, to me and to the bipartisan group, and abide by this agreement. If he does not, of course, and I expect he will have breached the trust of not only the Democratic senators, but members of his own party as well. Through these complicated and lengthy negotiations, Democrats have always sought to be reasonable, to act in good faith, and get something real done. Despite all of our entreaties, the President was obstinate. Despite bipartisan support for DACA, the Republican majority dithered. The Senate has muddled along for too long, content to delay action on our most pressing challenges until the very last moment. That ends today. The Republican majority now has 17 days to prevent the Dreamers from being deported. Mr. President, we have a way to address the fate of the Dreamers, starting right now, instead of waiting until March, with the minority and the moderate middle empowered to bring a bill to the floor instead of being held by the most strident anti-immigration voices in the Republican caucus. And we, on our side of the aisle, will continue to fight as strongly as we can for the Dreamers in the weeks ahead. I say to all Americans, urge your senators to vote yes on the bipartisan compromise when it comes forward. Write, tweet, email, phone, visit, do everything you can so we can finally pass this bill. In a few hours, the government will reopen. We have a lot to do. The issue of the Dreamers demands resolution. A budget must be written. Health care has to be addressed. Relief provided to disaster-stricken parts of our country. Pensions and opioids, veterans, child care, all have to be taken care of. The Trump shutdown will soon end, but the work must go on, and it will. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Go ahead. Go.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I want to thank the Democratic leader for his comments and his indication that he intends to support the measure before us. I think if we've learned anything, during this process, it's that a strategy to shut down the government over the issue of illegal immigration is something the American people didn't understand and would not have understood in the future. So I'm glad we've gotten past that, and we have a chance now to get back to work. And therefore, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Is there objection? Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the motion to concur with a further amendment in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 195 with a further amendment shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. President, before we call the roll, I ask unanimous consent that the Democratic whip be allowed to address the chamber for 3 minutes with the gracious approval of the Majority Leader.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, let me thank you very much and thank the Majority Leader for this opportunity. And let me thank my friend, my colleague, and our leader on the Democratic side for his passionate personal commitment to this issue involving the Dreamers and DACA. He has been by my side, and I've been inspired by his leadership from the start. And let me thank my colleagues. So many of you cast a vote that was very hard and very difficult because you believed, as I did, that the issue of immigration, the issue of the Dreamers, is the civil rights issue of our time. You stuck your necks out and said, I'm willing to go on record even if it's going to be hard to explain back home, and I will never forget that. The question now is how we move forward. What I have seen here on the floor of the Senate in the last few days is something we have not seen for years. Constructive, bipartisan conversations and dialogue on the floor, not just about this issue, which is obviously front and center, but about the future of this institution and what the Senate will be from this point forward. That, to me, has been encouraging because it says to me that we do have an opportunity to work together. My special thanks to Senator Susan Collins, my friend, and Senator Lisa Murkowski for joining with Jeff Flake and joining with Lindsey Graham and joining with Cory Gardner and others who've been working on this issue for so long to try to make a positive impact on this debate so that we can move forward. I cannot tell my colleagues how many have come up to me from the other side of the aisle and said, we're with you on this issue. We want to help you get this done. Each of them has a little different take on what that means, but I do believe them. And I do believe we have this opportunity to move together. Now comes the test, the real test, as to whether we can get this done, whether we can be the Senate again, whether we can return to a regular order on the floor and constructively have a debate. For some of you, it will be the first time you've ever seen it. But believe me, it's worth the price of admission, all it took for you to come to the United States Senate. So now we have to stand together. My last word is this. We have gathered the largest bipartisan group of senators to ever commit to moving forward on the DREAM Act and immigration. We have a process. I want to thank Senator McConnell for explicitly saying today it will be a level playing field. It will be open to both sides. We will move to the issue, as you characterized it this morning, of DACA and immigration. Thank you for doing that. I believe that that sets the stage for us to work together. For the first time in 5 years, we will have a debate on the floor of the Senate on the DREAM Act and immigration. To all the Dreamers who are watching today, don't give up. I know that your lives are hanging in the balance on what we do here on Capitol Hill and with the White House. 3 weeks from now, I hope to be joining you in celebrating the passage with you and your families and your communities of a measure which will strengthen America and give you an opportunity to be part of our future. Mr. President, I yield.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Collins. Yes. Children. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Cochran. Gotcha. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Thank you. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. I did, thanks. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Testimony. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Mr. Donnelly. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Gardner. Gotcha. Mrs. Gillibrand. Gotcha. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Thank you. Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, sir. Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Casey, Mr. Leahy, not yet, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Baldwin, Barrasso, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Cantwell, Capito, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Cassidy, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Cruz, Daines, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Ernst, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Graham, Hassan, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kane, Kennedy, King, Klobuchar, Lankford, Manchin, McCaskill, McConnell, Murkowski, Murray, Nelson, Perdue, Peters, Portman, Reed, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sass, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Thune, Tillis, Toomey, Udall, Van Hollen, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Young. Mr. Burr. Aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, aye. Ms. Smith, aye. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Hoeven, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Blumenthal, Cortez Masto, Feinstein, Gillibrand, Harris, Hirono, Leahy, Lee, Menendez, Merkley, Murphy, Paul, Sanders, Tester, and Warren. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Moran. Aye. Mr. Sullivan. Aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or wishing to change their vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 81, the nays are 18. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. Cloture having been invoked, the motion to refer falls.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, let me tell you how pleased I am, the people of Maryland, that we are now in the process of ending this government shutdown. The government shutdown does not benefit anyone. It certainly doesn't benefit the federal workers who live in Maryland and the federal workers around the nation. The uncertainty that a shutdown brings, those that are exempted are asked to work without knowing when they would get a paycheck. Those that are on furlough don't know whether they'll ever get a paycheck or not. It's not in the interest of our federal workforce. It's certainly not in the interest of federal contractors who depend upon contracts that have been put on suspension. It's not in the interest of the public who depend upon governmental services, and it ends up costing taxpayers more money. So, Mr. President, I'm pleased to see that we're on path to end this shutdown, to get government back up and a path forward. I also am pleased that we've at least accelerated by 2 weeks the deadline for getting a budget done. Many of us have expressed major concern about continuing to operate under a continuing resolution. That makes no sense. We heard from the Department of Defense that they cannot keep our country safe on continuing resolutions. We know that agencies, when they're trying to plan their mission, cannot operate on continuing resolutions. For the public, continuing resolutions state that we're going to operate on last year's budget. It doesn't reflect this year's. It doesn't reflect this year's priorities, and that's what we should be doing every year. So, in this case, the Republicans control the House, the Senate, and the White House. We would think that a budget could have been done by October 1, which is when the fiscal year began, October 1 of last year. We're now approaching 4 months under the FY18 budget, and we still don't have a budget. So one of the parts that I am pleased about as we move forward, we've had real, I think, positive discussions that by the February the 8th date, it's realistic to expect that we're going to be able to enact budget numbers so that the Appropriations Committee can recommend to the full chamber and we can pass appropriation bills or a cromnibus or an omnibus that will allow our agencies to have full-year appropriations, or I should say the remainder of this year's appropriations. And I certainly hope that will include FY19. That would certainly be the best. And that it will be balanced between the needs of the Department of Defense and the non-defense agencies. We have critical functions that require to have a full year of appropriations for, including our national defense, Department of Defense, our State Department, the Department of Health, and the work that's done in National Institutes of Health, food safety, and the Federal Drug Administration, the ability of the Social Security Administration to deliver checks to our seniors and to take care of our health care needs. All that requires that we have the predictability of a budget. So I'm pleased that we were able, during this debate, I wasn't pleased we had a shutdown, but I'm pleased that during this debate we had great discussions among Democrats and Republicans that we are committed to bringing out a budget by February the 8th so that we can give that type of predictability to the people of this country. That was one of the principal frustrations that many of us didn't want to go for another continuing resolution without knowing how we're going to deal with the budget. There are some special needs that we've had particular attention to that we really also need to get done by no later than February the 8th. One of that is the opioid funding. Opioid funding, clearly, it's in our national interest to recognize that we have a national crisis. Every community in the country is suffering from the opioid crisis, and we need to make sure that we give the wherewithal for the federal government to be a strong partner in dealing with this crisis. Many of my colleagues have talked about disaster relief. We certainly need to give help to the communities of Texas and Florida, the Puerto Rico, the wildfires of the West. We know that we've got to get that done now. We can't wait another month. Let us make sure that by no later than February the 8th, we've also dealt with that issue. I'm pleased in the legislation that we're considering now that we will deal with the Children's Health Insurance Program. I wish it was permanent. Rather than putting another deadline on the program, we should try to make this permanent. It's been bipartisan success program in all of our states, and the Children's Health Insurance Program needs further attention for permanency. However, the legislation that we're in the process of passing does not deal with community health centers. We know that most of our children, parents that are using the CHIP program are going to be using health centers. We need to extend the programs for our health centers. There are a lot of extenders out there, Mr. President, we need to act on. Just to mention one, the one that I've been interested in and have authored legislation deals with the therapy caps. Therapy caps mean that those who have the most serious needs for therapy services, those suffering from stroke, those type of injuries, are not able to get the full services, or at least threatened not able to get the full services because of a therapy cap. We've extended it ever since we put it into law. It should never have been put into law, the caps, but we also need to pay attention to it in this budget debate, and that also needs to be dealt with by February the 8th. My colleagues, we brought up the serious pension issues that affect the workers in this country. That needs to be addressed. So there's reason to say that I'm pleased that the government's back up, or will be back up shortly, but we really need to negotiate and not operate under continuing resolutions. I think the amount of spotlight that's been put on these issues, we have a much better chance to get to these budget issues resolved through appropriations or a cromnibus or an omnibus rather than another continuing resolution. And then, Mr. President, there is the issue of the Dreamers that I have talked about numerous times on the floor of the United States Senate. The Dreamer issue is urgent. It's urgent. Many Dreamers' lives have already been affected, and their lives have been changed as a result of President Trump's announcement last September, putting a 6-month time limit on when the Dreamers would be subject to deportation. That deadline occurs early March, but in the meantime, those that are up for renewal status, there's been uncertainty as to whether they will be able to continue to reside here in America, that they'll be able to continue to have a driver's license or work. They feel like they have, and they do have, a date on the back of their body saying that they expire on a particular date. That anxiety needs to end. It should never have been started under President Trump's edict in September, but we need to respond to that in an urgent way. So I was very pleased that we have a commitment from the majority leader that by no later than February the 8th, if we have not passed the bipartisan DACA protection, Dreamer protection bill, that we will have that bill on the floor of the United States Senate in a manner in which the majority, that the Senate can speak. And I'm very confident that the compromise that have been negotiated with Senator Graham and Senator Durbin, we will be able to pass that bill that would protect the Dreamers. Yes, it does. What it does is it allows the Dreamer status to maintain and puts them in a pathway so they can have permanent citizenship here in the United States, and they know that their future is America. After all, it's the only country that most know. So that is certainly a very encouraging sign. I was also very pleased to hear in the negotiations that took place that legislation would also provide the protection for those that are here in temporary protective status. President Trump, in some of the cases, has extended dates and said this is the last extension that could expire within the next 18 months. In some cases, he's deferred making that decision for some countries. What we know about those in temporary protective status, they're very similar to the Dreamers. That many know no country but the United States as their home, and it's important that we protect their status here in the United States and provide them a pathway for permanency and citizenship here in the United States. They are part of America, and they are part of our economy. In the meantime, Mr. President, I would hope that there would be a consensus here and support from the White House that the enforcement procedures that are being used against the immigrant community is mindful of the efforts being made here to provide them a permanent status, and that the priorities on enforcement that we've heard mentioned many times, which quite frankly are very confusing to the immigrant community, that those priorities would not aim at those that are going to be protected under the legislation that we will be considering in the next few weeks. So, Mr. President, we all are pleased that we are now able to move forward to keep government open, that we have a commitment to deal with the budget of our country by February the 8th and the Dreamer issue by that date, that we've made real progress. As Senator Durbin observed, and I must tell you, I think each of us did also, that during this very difficult time, the conversations that we've had among our colleagues on both sides of the aisle have been very encouraging. I think the members of this body want to return to the great traditions of the United States Senate, where we listen to each other, where we work together, where we compromise, and we're able to come to successful completion of our work. Too much work virtually no work has been done, but too much is on the table right now that needs to get finished. And let us take advantage of these next few weeks to show the American people that indeed we will work together in the best interest of our country, putting partisan politics aside, dealing with our budget issues, dealing with our immigration issues, dealing with our health care issues, dealing with our pension issues. We can do the people's work. Let's get that done, and let's start right now in getting that work completed. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.